let's take a look at Unit Summary Form 3, which covers the Renaissance up to the Baroque. The first thing we're going to talk about is the early Renaissance. This is from around the mid-1300s to maybe 1400. Maybe a little bit before that, maybe after that. What is the purpose of art during this period? Well, it's to tell religious stories or honor religious figures. That's pretty much the same as it had been in earlier eras when we're talking about Europe. And the subject matter has to be religious in nature. It was still the church that was commissioning much of the art. Of course, as you've seen in the Gombrich textbook, various artists attempted to do other sorts of things, perhaps doodling on around the extra pages of a manuscript, perhaps little cartoonish sorts of figures, but that wasn't considered art. When we talk about art, it was related to these subject matters. Now, some use of perspective came into vogue, primarily positional perspective associated with Giotto. One of your exercise questions deals with that. I just thought I'd put a little plug in here for that. You have to read the entire exercise question. The exercise question dealing with Giotto rightly says that he pioneered the use of positional perspective, one object in front of another, but it identifies positional perspective as something that where objects recede in a mathematical way as they go off into the distance. That's linear perspective. That's not what Giotto used. So you have to read the whole of the exercise statements when you're doing the online exercises. And you might get tripped up on other statements that also have multiple parts. What's the technology? Well, there's two things I look for in terms of technology. One of them is pretty self-apparent from the textbook, and that is the use of egg tempera painting. And it was refined very highly when we get to the Wilton diptych. Also sculpture and architecture. But another one that arises just because you have to sort of start thinking about this in relationship to one of the sculptures you see, where the sculptor actually put himself into the sculpture. How did he do that? Well, it turned out that before this time, mirrors were kind of hard to come by. But mirror technology evolved by this time, and people were able to start seeing reflections of themselves. So the development and availability of mirrors leads to experimentation with self-portraits. Now, the impact of this era, it sets the stage for the development of additional perspective techniques. And that means that the idea of realism begins to creep in. Now, how is realism rationalized with the church's admonition that art should not be distractive, that it shouldn't be beautiful in itself, it should tell a religious story to people who can't read for themselves? Well, the way the artists began to rationalize it was by making the scene very realistic. They put the viewer into it so they could better understand what was going on in the Bible story. It was a handy rationalization, and it paid off. It led to a lot of experimentation and finally the development of 5 types of scientific perspective, which I summarize for you on page 118 in the workbook. Now, I bring that to your attention because page 118 is going to be very important for you to know about when you approach Project 4, which deals with the 5 types of scientific perspective and a couple of examples from the Renaissance and Baroque for each. So keep page 118 in mind. That's not a page to skip over. That's one that you really need to spend some time looking at. Let's take a look now at the next era that I would be looking for you to document, and that's Northern Europe, Europe in the 1400s to the Renaissance. Here again, the purpose of art was, as in an earlier era, to tell religious stories, honor religious figures, and also to commemorate significant events. The subject matter of the art had to be religious in nature. That is, it had to portray a religious scene, some event from the Bible, or it had to portray religious figures. And usually those two were combined. Now, what about technology? This is really important. This is the era in which oil was developed as a binder, not in the earlier era. I realize in the story of art it may be a little confusing because he covers sometimes the same areas in different eras or different areas in the same era. But what I'm looking for here is that you identify this particular period in Northern Europe as the place and the time where oil was developed as a binder. And oil painting was quickly adopted by artists because of the many advantages. It dried slower than tempera, and it was more translucent, meaning artists could layer one layer of paint over another, and the color from underneath would show through to some extent, so it was a way of mixing colors without actually mixing the pigments together. The other types of technology, sculpture and architecture, of course, were still pervasive in this era. Also in technology in this era, this was when movable type printing was invented. Now, the Chinese had block printings before this, but movable type was the big invention that Gutenberg came up with in 1453. And that set the stage for the further development of other types of printing. We talk about relief printing, intaglio printing. That's different than movable type. Now, there's another page in your workbook that summarizes these different types of printing and also talks about lithography and silkscreen printing. Those are different methods of creating artwork through printing processes, and it will be good for you to know that as you approach some of the exercise problems and some of the other work that you're called upon to do, mainly the reflective essay. What is the impact? The major impact here, aside from printing, of course, being widely pervasive these days, and it was in the hundreds of years following the invention of the movable type and the printing press, is that oil painting is still a widely used medium. It's the most widely used medium. We have other mediums available, but oil painting is still primarily the way that artists work in painting the kind of paintings you see behind me on the wall. Now let's take a look at another era. This is Tuscany and Rome in the late 1400s. Tuscany is the northern part of Italy. It includes Florence. The purpose of art in this period to decorate churches or the residences of church officials and the wealthy. And the rules for this include making the depictions of the scenes as realistic as possible using perspective techniques. The subject matter could be religious or it could be mythological and classical. During this era, artists began to, especially artists in Florence and artists associated with the Renaissance, were reviving Greek and Roman mythology, those subjects being regarded as classical and therefore legitimate as subjects for what we call art with a capital A. Fresco, that is, painting with pigments directly on wet plaster, was raised to a new level of perfection in this era. And linear perspective was perfected, as was light focus and atmospheric perspective. Those are the five perspectives. When you add those four together with positional perspective, those are the five scientific perspectives. Also in this area, Greek and Roman building forms were revived. That is, the use of columns, the use of the attic area, which is called a pediment, and other features of Greek temples became associated with classicism and the Roman and Greek eras, and were emulated by artists at this time. They revived those as styles of architecture that were admired. This started to replace Gothic architecture, and the transition from one to the other was sometimes a little crude in terms of people combining elements of Gothic architecture with ancient Roman or Greek building styles. Now, the sculptors in this era equaled or surpassed the skill of ancient sculptors by studying human anatomy, the human form. Da Vinci was very famous for this, cutting up cadavers to find out how the muscles worked, and a lot of other scientific interests that he had. Artists in this time, Michelangelo, for example, able to create in stone such accurate renditions of the human body in such artistic ways that some people feel they even surpass the accomplishments of the ancient Greeks. Technology, oil painting, sculpture, architecture, of course. And the important impact is artists now have a full range of perspective techniques and high-quality oil binders to work with. So you might say, as some people at the time felt, that painting had been perfected, that it had reached its highest form and it really couldn't reach any higher form of expression because they had these marvelous tools to describe things accurately visually and to paint them using oils with a wide range of capabilities beyond pigments and colorants and binders that existed earlier. Now, let's take a look at the late Renaissance. This is the 1500s in Venice. Big difference between Venice and Florence. One of them was the access to colors being imported from the Middle East and even farther east of that. Lapis lazuli, for example, coming from Afghanistan. The port in which most of these landed was Venice, so the Venetian artists had the greatest access to these types of colorants, and they really reveled in using color in their artwork. Also light, and Gombrich suspects that because of the high reflection of light off the water in Venice, because of the canals, that artists tended to envision light as an element way beyond what the Florentine artists envisioned it. So the big emphasis here, once again, the purpose of art to decorate churches, residences of officials, or the wealthy, to make depictions of scenes as realistic as possible using perspective techniques. But here's a big difference with technology between the Venetians and the Florentines. They used color and light to balance the compositions. That is, areas of color might balance some other object in a symmetrical way. Not the same type of object repeated in a mirror image, but just a large block of color. And light with very heavy chiaroscuro effects, so that you would have a very vivid light source in one area, casting shadows and maybe even making silhouettes of some of the people standing in the foreground. This was very innovative, and it added to the techniques that artists would use in developing paintings. Also in this era, artists began to be recognized individually and develop a reputation of their own. So they're not, some of them anyway, are not regarded as craftsmen any longer. That is, all the way back from ancient times, the definition of this manual labor, getting your hands dirty, as being what we would call blue-collar work, not professional, not intellectual. The artists started to become more renowned in their own right, and various people like the popes would seek out a particular artist for a particular type of commission, and wanted that particular person and no one else, because that person had developed a real expertise and reputation for carrying out that kind of work well. Let's move on to Northern Europe in the 1500s, the Reformation. The Reformation, of course, means the reforming of some aspects of church worship. Martin Luther kicked this off in 1517, 1519, when he began a dialogue by posting 95 objections he had to the way that the Catholic Church was operating and causing worship to be conducted. He himself was a Catholic, a member of a Catholic order, but this rebellion sparked a bigger revolution than he thought it would, because already people had problems with the church selling indulgences, the lavish way that the popes were rebuilding Rome. The tenor of the times was such that politically also there were reasons that various rulers wanted to distance themselves from the direct rule of the Pope in political matters. In any case, what happened was large areas of Northern Europe became Protestant, that is, Christian but not Catholic. And this developed into several different types of denominations. The biggest difference impacting art was that in Protestant churches, in getting away from the adoration of the Virgin Mary and statues, the people who were in charge of the churches did not want to commission artwork to decorate the churches. Churches became much plainer. So artists, because they used to be employed to decorate churches primarily, found that the type of employment they could gain was much more limited. And this eventually caused them to develop other genres of art that could be used to decorate homes. So art becomes a decorative furnishing in homes of the less wealthy, the middle class. And the valid subject matter for art broadens considerably to include portraits and still lifes, landscapes, seascapes, peasant life scenes. I've documented a progression of this on one of the pages of the workbook, and there's a lecture on that as well. It's really interesting to see how paintings that might have decorated a church, having been commissioned by a donor, painting the donor into the picture, when we no longer wanted that type of art to decorate the church, perhaps just the painting of the donor as a portrait would be of interest. And eventually what happened was the portrait included objects related to that person, their work, or some other aspect of their life. And eventually the person was worked out of the drawing, the painting, and the objects themselves became the subjects of the art as still lifes. So this is one way that genres of art progressed. The technology again included oil painting, sculpture, architecture. A development occurred also in this area called the camera oscura. This was originally a room that had a pinhole in one wall, And people discovered that that pinhole actually focused the outside scene and projected it on the opposite wall, upside down, but it was an accurate depiction of what was outside of the room. Now, today we might think of that pinhole as a lens focusing the light. The image was very dim, but it was possible to use that image and to sort of trace it and then use that as a guide for developing a painting. And we think Vermeer did a lot of this in developing his perspective paintings. Some people think that's cheating, that you didn't develop it just with your own talents. Other people say, well, it's quite all right, because this was just a smart way to get the perspective lines, for example, on the square tiles on the floor that recedes into the distance, to get those perspective lines accurately. In any case, that camera oscura was a development of this era that a few hundred years later led into the camera that could take pictures when you replaced the paper on the wall opposite the pinhole with some light-sensitive surface that could then be developed so that we could make sense of the image that the light had caused on that chemical surface. More about that later, however. Impact also of the types of genres developed during this era, primarily in the Netherlands, was that developed a broadened acceptance of what was valid as subject matter for art. The abandonment of the idea that only classical or mythological figures can be painted and be regarded as true art. Finally, the last era that we cover in USF3 is Mannerism. And Mannerism, as Gombrich points out, is the era that followed the demise of the artists of the Renaissance. They were acknowledged as such masters. Many people felt that their paintings could not even be achieved by others, let alone excelled in terms of virtuosity by others. So artists of the following era had a tough job because they had to distinguish themselves somehow. Some of them turned to novel arrangements of compositions, long neck, for example, or distortions in perspective, strangeness and novelty introduced into artwork. Others tried to paint and copy the manner of the masters of the Renaissance, hence the word Mannerism. The thing about this era is that this experimentation with different ways of depicting things, novel compositions, I think in a way led into and set the stage for the Baroque era, where some additional types of strange constructions and sometimes thought to be outlandish sorts of arrangements came to be commonplace. In this era, technology included once again oil painting, sculpture, architecture. In this era, as in earlier eras, the purpose of art was primarily in Catholic areas to decorate churches or the residences of church officials. But in Protestant areas, of course, the wide array of genres of art pioneered by the Dutch began to take hold. And that wraps up my review of USF3.